Hello, Ephraim. It's a pleasure to have you. All right, Ephraim, it's nice to meet you. And we're going to go ahead and jump into the Wars for Independence comparison. Okay. So if you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to unmute yourself at any time. Okay. And I will likely give you 10 extra credit points for being here today. So I greatly appreciate your being here. And let's jump right into it. So to give you some context to the American War for Independence, right? There's not a single narrative that monopolizes the topic. I have a few that are pretty popular that I wanted to include, and this comes from my U.S. history class. But again, I want to give you context because this class is Mexican American history. And so it's all within the context of American history. So with number one, right, they call this the salutary neglect thesis. And that is that to the British, especially, right, the American War for Independence was about fighting to keep a good thing going. That the English did not impose their restrictions over Americans' lives very effectively. And so Americans were relatively free to do as they pleased for quite some time. And then the English tried to crack down on them, having felt like they were not pulling their weight in the British Empire. And then, of course, the spoiled Americans, by this account, fight to keep that good thing going. So with number one, that's what you see is the first category is politics. You see the assembly, which is an elected body of representatives from each of the 13 colonies. So there were 13 different assemblies, and they were representatives of the other colonists, right? Now, how representative were they? That varied from time to time. In some cases, you'll notice that a lot of the assemblymen, when you look at Howard Zinn's book, for instance, were not a mini example, were not necessarily a microcosm of the people that they represented. Oftentimes they felt as if they were better off. Oftentimes they were time in and time out elected into office, and kind of represented a class in and of themselves that considered itself superior to the average common American farmer or artisan or skilled worker, etc. So at any rate, the assemblies began garnering powers for themselves that were never intended by Mother England. You see examples like Massachusetts, especially in the New England colonies up in the north, whereby they received powers over the salary of their governor, to tax emanated from the lower house of the assembly. The upper house was a royal council. They were handpicked gentlemen by the governors oftentimes, and in the royal colonies at least. And so it was a republican form of government that we had under England. And you can make the argument that we maintained a republican form of government after independence, thus begging the question, did we really have a revolution? Did we really have a 180-degree turn politically? According to this thesis, we did not. Not a lot changed. The assemblies became rather powerful in comparison to the royal councils and the royal governors. And they kept that going during the war and after the War for Independence in the state legislators. And so the second category, besides politically gaining powers for themselves in the assemblies, and you have to remember also, is the American War for Independence was not necessarily always about human rights. Yes, our propaganda stated such. They used that term, human rights, the rights of man, etc., that they borrowed from Enlightenment works, Scottish liberal works, etc. But they also oftentimes contended that they were their English rights, right? And so nice to have you, Miguel. So with their rights as Englishmen, they believed, what you have to remember with the English Constitution is it's not, it was not written down. It was meant to be like a growing living organism that evolves over time. And so they look at different, it gets messy. For instance, you have the rights of Englishmen that began to evolve from at least probably at least the 1300s, arguably in England, and those rights began to be acquired piecemeal, right? As far as their rights, their political protection rights. If someone were to break the law against them, the right to defend themselves in a court of law, etc., the right to participate in government, and then it was confined to one office or another office, like in the House of Commons back in England itself, as the lower house of Parliament, and then you have rights, like I said, a participation, rights of protection, rights of economic opportunities, because under the English, you had the royal patronage system. And the patronage system is you had to have the patronage, the support of your superiors to engage in certain political offices, and also to engage in certain economic transactions, buy certain lands, have certain aristocratic privileges given to you. And so the British did have that type of an actual aristocracy. And remember, aristoi means the best in Greek. So the aristocracy claimed certain rights and opportunities that the common Englishman did not have. So when you look back at England itself, there were many ways in which, by today's standards, the democratic nature of the British Republic was a little bit weak. Not a lot of opportunities, not a lot of powers, not a lot of privileges for the actual common Englishman living in Sussex County, in London, and Bristol or Liverpool, etc. And so then when they began colonizing, they said, okay, well, we're going to have it go by blood, and it'll go through the blood of the father. And then that evolved to that of the mother, that if you have a father or mother, if you have parents who have the rights of Englishmen back in England, and you move to one of England's colonies, then you are to be afforded the same rights and opportunities. But even then, it was confined, oftentimes, at least the participatory part of citizenship was confined to men only. Women were marginalized at that time, right, under the English. So by today's standards, it's not very impressive. It was a rather aristocratic setup, but it was supposed to evolve, right, organically. And that's what kind of happened. And so, and then also they had some precedents with the C that were established in a court of law that stated that, okay, even if you're not of English blood, if you are granted denizenship, like temporary citizenship rights by the king, by the crown himself, or if you're an immigrant and you apply for some form of naturalization and you're born and you live in an English colony, an official colony, then you might have certain opportunities to gain some rights as an Englishman. And so with the American colonists, when their assemblies began, garnering these powers over the governor's salary and over taxes, etc., over the rights of a trial by jury, etc., here in the New World, they felt as if that was in line with the English Constitution, that once they established those rights, those precedents here in the New World, that they were set in stone under the English Constitution. And that's where you have Benjamin Franklin, and he traveled to England and he had a debate with Parliament and contended, right, that here in this given year, and he had done his homework, In this given year, the assemblies had grabbed this power. In that given year, we had the rights of suspects guaranteed for being tried for, oh goodness, smuggling, right? And so he would establish those precedents with the C and contend that now they were within their rights as Englishmen, as English colonists here in the New World. And of course, they contended against the German immigrants having those same rights and other non-English, non-WASP groups of demographics of people that immigrated here into North America. And so they had a narrow, confined view, many of the American patriots, as to who should be granted the rights of Englishmen. But then we're going to get to the rights, the human rights, and how that was much broader. But you can make the argument that that may not have played as pivotal of a role in the war for independence in America as some would like to believe, as they'd like us to believe as children in school. So at any rate, then also you have economic opportunities. And so people began basically smuggling, being able to trade in products and goods that they did not officially have papers and the written authorization to trade, but they did so anyway. So famously, John Hancock, right, became very wealthy and very conspicuously powerful and seen as a self-made man, but he had done so without the proper English papers. And he had done so rather openly and defiantly against the mercantilist system of the English. Because under patronage and in the mercantilist system, again, what economic opportunities you had oftentimes were contingent upon your family connections. To whom, right? And so when Americans began to do as they please, at the end of the French and Indian War, the English government found itself largely in debt. And they said, okay, now we're going to crack down on the American colonists. They have been doing as they please virtually economically without the proper papers. We're going to rectify that. We're going to bring in our customs officials, and they are going to be like highway patrolmen, checking and seeing if people have the proper papers to trade in the commodities in which they're trading, or else we're gonna arrest them for smuggling and confiscate their goods and their profits. And so they did that even to John Hancock and others in this very symbolic crackdown, if you will, at the end of the War of 1812. You also had kind of almost a consensus between the liberals and the conservatives back in the English Parliament that Americans needed to be put in their place and needed to bear their brunt of the load of government, as opposed to those back in England and other colonies. So at any rate, when, of course, the English tried to crack down with the taxes, right? So, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, etc. The colonies began to show a sort of camaraderie that was not necessarily anticipated back in England. Matter of fact, there were on more than one occasion they felt if they could put the rabble-rouser, defiant people in Virginia and in Massachusetts in particular in their place, make some arrests, make some crackdowns on illegal acquisitions of wealth, and put the local colonial assemblies in their place, that the other colonies will follow in tow. They'll bow to English Parliament. Notice I say Parliament because a lot of this conflict was between Parliament and the colonies, to such an extent that some people believe that King George III was a very convenient scapegoat as a single monarch, to be seen as a tyrant of such. So at any rate, yeah, and so the Americans are going to show a sense of camaraderie, a sense of unification that was not anticipated by the English. They're going to form their committees of correspondence that are going to connect the assemblies from one colony to the next. Eventually, of course, that's going to culminate in the Continental Congress, the two Continental Congresses that were created amongst the assemblymen of the various colonies, uniting together, trying to spread news when one colony was cracked down upon, so that there could be a concerted effort into standing up for their rights, either as Englishmen or both as human beings. So at any rate, yeah, and you have the Boston Massacre in March of 1770 that elicited a lot of public reaction. You have, after that, the proliferation of a lot of pamphlets and literature and propaganda against the English, and that's where you're going to get a lot of things written from the Enlightenment, from the Scottish libertarians who feared big government, and from the Great Awakening, etc. And so you're going to have your intelligentsia amongst the Americans kind of unify across the Atlantic Ocean with some of the writers back in England itself, some of the journalists and others who were standing their ground and contending that the English Parliament and King George III were not affording enough rights and opportunities to enough people back in England itself, much less in her colonies. And of course, I think of like James Dickinson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson used the pen rather effectively to disseminate ideas of defiance on paper. And so then it's going to culminate in Massachusetts. You're going to have a fist fight between a colonial, well, that was the Boston Massacre. But no, beyond that, the intolerable acts, right? Followed by, which were preceded by the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, when the British government gave a monopoly to the English East India Company to alone trade tea to the colonists, and they kept a symbolic tax on the tea. The Americans threw the tea in the Boston Harbor, and that's when they tried to make an example of Boston and of Massachusetts in particular. And they shut down the colonial assembly, the voice, the democratic voice, if you will, of the state of Massachusetts. They shut down the ports. They began confiscating property. They set up naval trials within the cities of Boston and other major cities themselves to make an example of smugglers and have them tried in the very populations where they were, and that brought up a big anti-British sentiment. And so when they tried to crack down on Massachusetts, by that time, the Committees of Correspondence had allied the separate 13 colonies, with the exception of Rhode Island. And they began to have their colonial assemblymen meet up in concert and decide that they were going to issue up a list of grievances and demands upon Parliament and to King George III, along with an olive branch petition to try to make peace at the last minute. And then word spread that the rebels were, because what happened is as they began shutting down assemblies in New York and Massachusetts, et cetera, and that was the democratic voice of the colonies, the royal governors began giving ultimatums to their assemblies in the other 11 states, the other 11 colonies. And that really made people, it pushed their back to the wall in choosing a side. And they split. And you had Tories who remained loyal to England, and you had those rebels or patriots who contended, no, we're not going to abide by by violations of our English rights, among them right to trade and to do what we want economically, and to tax ourselves and to be sovereign over our own legislation in the form of our assemblies at the colonial level. And so under the governors, their militias began to split up. Those who remained loyal to England and those who chose to be patriots. And those who chose to be patriots boasted that they would be ready at a moment's notice and a minute's notice to fight for the rights of the people of their colonies, hence the term Minutemen. And so word spread out that the American patriots or rebels were planning to fight. And that's when General Gage was sent from Boston to Concord to Massachusetts to catch any ringleaders of Minutemen and any political leaders of the Committees of Correspondence in this burgeoning Continental Congress and have them arrested for treason. And in doing so, violence ensued at Lexington. No one knows who fired the first shots. Yeah, they began being sniped, the British soldiers, on their way back to Boston. And thus we had a fight on our hands. So with number one, you're looking at the thesis that Americans, this is kind of a pro-British view, as the Americans pretty much were already doing as they pleased economically, politically, empowered themselves, even at the expense of Mother England, prior to the French and Indian War. And so when the English tried to put them in their place at the end of the French and Indian War, the Americans felt they almost by habit, by tradition, and by instinct desire to fight to keep a good thing going. All right. So that's known as the salutary neglect thesis. Some people adhere to it in explaining our war for independence. And then America is a special enlightened nation. This is the interpretation of court history, right? That praises the winners of our country. This is the type of history that we oftentimes received as children. And that is right, is that we are an exceptional, special country. We were not birthed upon naked desire for power, covetousness of resources, anything base like that, but that we were fighting for human rights, things that we felt that all human beings ought to be entitled to. And so you probably have studied it at least a bit, the Enlightenment. And so you think of like going back to Rousseau and Locke and their notions of human rights in a state of nature, their idea that before governments were artificially conceived, that man in a state of nature lived just that, in complete autonomy, complete freedom, complete independence. But that man being who he is, it was inevitable that some men were going to abuse that autonomy, and they were going to step upon the rights and the well-being of their neighbors, of some of their neighbors. So in the state of nature, right, this is their theoretical approach to government in its origins, is that people began to do the balance, right? And say, okay, I absolutely love, and this weighs rather heavily to me, I love my complete freedom in the state of nature without government, but I also cannot stand, and it's beginning to outweigh the former. I cannot stand the anarchy and the abuses that happen in complete freedom. And so therefore, begrudgingly, they felt mankind at one given time in human history decided to give up some of his autonomy, some of his rights and independence in favor of and in return for certain protections from the first governments. And with those protections, the idea was is those first governments were intended to be the servant, not the master of the governed. That their sole purpose was to ensure that no one was defrauded of his property, that no one was stripped of his liberty by someone else, right? So that this type of government was to ensure man's basic natural rights. And when you get into natural rights, like I said, you have Rousseau and Locke, and they talked about people's natural rights to their life, to their liberty, and to their property. And property didn't just intend to cover that narrow notion of the word property today. It also entailed anything that man works for by the sweat of his brow. He deserves to reap the benefits thereof. And so I say that because the natural right to property, absolutely, in my subjective opinion, goes counter to slavery, right? Because with slavery, it's unrequited labor. You're working your bottom off and you're not getting a thing back for your labor. So just kind of something to think about, that if you really truly adhere to that enlightened principle of human rights, and remember that a human right, right? The idea of a civic right is what the government gives, the government can take away. But if it's a human right, you're entitled to it by virtue of being a human being, right? And by the creator, etc. That you're entitled to those rights by virtue of being a human being. And so government doesn't have a choice, theoretically, under the Enlightenment, but to acquiesce, to give in, and to acknowledge your rights as a human being. So beyond life, liberty, and property, you have the basic rights of self-cultivation by Diderot and Condorcet, who wrote like the French encyclopedias. And they were really into the fact that every man ought to be able to improve himself, be able to go to school, be able to learn a trade, be able to just educate and refine himself and improve himself in every virtual way. And there ought not to be any artificial or legal obstacles or impediments to that right of self-cultivation. Again, slaves did not have the right of self-cultivation. And by virtue of being human beings, right, that is one other example by which the Enlightenment is antithetical to and denounces slavery. And so at any rate, in addition to self-cultivation, you have the rights of being a suspect, of being suspected of having committed a crime. And that was Beccaria, and in his writings. And he spoke about, right, like the right, what we see in our Bill of Rights here in this country, the right to not have an unusually intrusive and unnecessary search and seizure into your property and into your privacy, to be able to defend yourself in a court of law, to have a trial by your peers, by people who know what it's like to walk in your shoes. So arguably from your own demographic and from your own geographical region, to be able to decide upon your innocence or guilt, to be able to counter the claims of your hostile witnesses and challenge what they contend against you, etc. So those are some examples of natural rights that were advocated, that were supported in the Enlightenment. That was real big beginning in the 1740s, especially in France. And so then you have the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers who were libertarians, Benjamin Hoadley, Trenchard and Gordon in their newspaper, etc. And these writers, these Scots, were libertarian in the true sense, right? That government should be as small and unobtrusive as possible, and that government ought to be a limited, necessary evil, and not constitute one drop more in scope and power and privileges and etc. And so to the Scots, right, they wrote that, kind of the Lord of the Rings type thing. They wrote that there is something inherently wrong with human nature when it comes to power, that mankind will inevitably abuse too much power, or what they termed as arbitrary power, having complete power over other people to be able to do as you please with them. And so they're very much against arbitrary power, and they were for limited powers, right? So for a written constitution to define what exactly a government can and what a government cannot do as far as being obtrusive into the lives of its citizens. All right. And so, and they also attacked the Anglican Church, the state church of England, the government sanctioned church of England, for abuses of power, etc. And so you had the Scottish Enlightenment as well, and you had the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening to me was largely about conditional deference. It was a religious movement that pretty much stated that deference, right? Knowing your place, bowing down to your superiors, that you ought to only do that upon certain conditions. And the main condition under the Great Awakening, arguably, was that you only do that when the people above you are really serving their office the way God wants them to serve their office. And so that was another big part of the rhetoric of in the propaganda of America's war for independence. So you put all those together, and you also, with the Enlightenment, they went back to Greco-Roman writers, and they wrote about, again, a lot of this tied together about limited government, governments that can become decadent and corrupt and tyrannical, that you have to fear. The steps toward tyranny are oftentimes incremental, one little step at a time. So hence, right, with the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act did not affect everyone, only those who had official papers that had to be stamped. And it was not burdensome as far as the amount of money. If I recall correctly, it wasn't even like half a pence, like half a cent. And but it's the principle of it, according to this rhetoric, right? That, yeah, you were before giving your consent to taxes by way of your assemblyman, your elected assemblyman. Now the British Parliament, and the King seems to be okay with it, has taken away that right of your assemblyman. And now the Parliament, where you're not represented, back in England, you have no elected reps sitting in Parliament. They are now giving you a tax. So no matter how small it is, right, it's the notion that if they're doing that today, what are they going to do tomorrow and the next year and the next year? That the steps toward tyranny are incremental. They're small, right? So that people will be lulled into acquiescence, into giving in and accepting them. So with number two, that's what you have, is that we had an enlightened revolution where we wanted a whole new world order. We wanted a world that was fashioned upon the Enlightenment primarily, right? And natural rights, etc. But again, right, did we have universal male citizenship in our war for independence? No. Did we do away with slavery in all the states? No. Right? And so to what extent did we really adhere to this rhetoric? And then number three, you have self-interest. You have groups of people like in an echelon of people that were assemblymen that got a taste of some power, but didn't have the same power as the royal council members and the royal governors, etc., right? And didn't have the highest positions in the military, like young George Washington, who were very ambitious and whose ambitions were thwarted because of the patronage system under England. They didn't have the right family name. They didn't have the right family connections. And that limited how highly they could ascend. And so, to what extent was the American War for Independence about sour grapes, about a contingent of Americans that didn't get what they wanted as far as their ambitions, and were smarting over that fact and were angry. Had George Washington been given Braddock's position in the French and Indian War, had he been able to run his farm without a counting house from England taking the lion's share of his profits and dictating the terms of his trade, had that not happened, would he have possibly been a Tory and stayed loyal to the English? Was it just personal grievances that led him to become a rebel leader? So it's something to think about coming out of this biography of George Washington. And then number 4 is Howard Zinn's thesis, and it's very cynical. And it contends that that demographic of people not only existed, but they hijacked the rebellion. That at a few pivotal points, like during the Stamp Act riots and with mob violence, etc., that there seemed to have been an angry element from below of the poor urban people in particular, and of the poor agrarian people as well, but especially those in the cities, where there was a great disparity between the haves and the have-nots in the Philadelphias and Bostons, etc., in New York cities of the country. And so that when the group of founding fathers who were well-to-do and were not arguably a mini example or microcosm of the people they represented, saw the masses begin to rise up during the War for Independence. Okay, this is a provocative thesis only, okay? Not saying this is the gospel truth, but something worth looking into. Were they appalled by that specter of a genuine class revolution, class-based revolution, and hence took over that rebellion and became its leaders, so they can keep the common people in their place, and they can kick the number 1 people of the socioeconomic and political pyramid out, the Brits themselves, the British royal officials, to have them kicked out, so they themselves, this founding father demographic, could be the most powerful men and most wealthy men left standing at the end of the War for Independence. So those are just a few of the popular interpretations to the War for Independence here in America. All right. And then we look at number 5, that which I want you to please analyze and evaluate. Now with number 5, right, you see elements that are kind of common to some of the narratives we've already heard. For instance, there were Bourbon Reforms by the Spanish monarchy, and the Bourbon Reforms loosened up some of the mercantilist restrictions and gave some of the criollos, in particular, the Spaniards that were born in the Americas, right, underneath those who were Spaniards from Spain and put in handpicked positions in the Americas, that the criollos were granted certain economic opportunities by way of the Bourbon Reforms that kind of whet their appetite, that gave them a taste for a better life, that gave them, that fed their ambition, right? But at the same time, politically, they took away some of the powers of some of the local offices in the New World that were inhabited by criollos, and gave them over to loyal Spaniards from Spain, peninsulares. And so the Bourbon Reforms kind of encouraged the criollos, but also provoked their anger, right, with the political part of it. So if you look up the term delegados and subdelegados, they took over positions like the alcalde mayor, the mayor position, that was oftentimes taken by a criollo. And the cabildos, the city councils, weren't no longer as powerful, and the criollos were well represented in the city councils. Now, because of the delegados and subdelegados, and these intendants, as they were called, came in straight from Spain and were granted more powers than possessed and practiced the criollos. So you have a degree to which you could foresee a class of people in the well-to-do criollos, right, who oftentimes thought of themselves like the founding fathers as a class in and of themselves, different from those from Mother Spain, just as the founding fathers saw themselves as distinct from the Brits, who were actually of English birth, right? But at the same time, different from and superior to those beneath them on the scale. And so you have the majority of people who were mestizos, right? Who were indigenous and Spanish mix of blood. The criollos, there was a sense of pride in their cultural tradition that they were of, quote, pure Spanish blood, like the Peninsulares. And so you have a degree to which, you know, like what you see in number 3 and number 4 of the American War for Independence, of an elite group that's going to take control of the wars for independence, that had its own axe to grind, that had its own agenda, that had its own self-interest in mind when you look at the Bourbon Reforms. However, you also see idealism, right? You see a sense of idealism. And to me, idealism is, you don't see the world as it is, you see it as it ought to be. You want to improve the world and make it a better place. You see a degree of idealism amongst many Criollo and other leaders of the wars for independence in Latin America. And for instance, right, when Napoleon in 1808 took over Spain, there was a political vacuum that was left, right, whereby Carlos IV and his son Fernando VII were virtually incarcerated by Napoleon. Napoleon put his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, and no one in the Americas was willing to acknowledge Joseph Bonaparte's reign over them. So during that political vacuum, what was the easiest thing to do to contend was that, well, a couple avenues they could have taken was, one is they could have acknowledged during that political vacuum the juntas, the committees that were formed in Spain's guerrilla warfare, peninsular war, as it was called, against Napoleon. Different cities, especially Seville, Cadiz, and these other major cities of Spain, formed these committees and contended that they were the true voice of the Spanish people and of the Spanish Empire, while their monarch or monarchs, plural, were incarcerated by Napoleon. They could have taken that route. They could have also contended, right? They just said, well, we only recognize, because there was widespread resentment against the father, Carlos IV of Spain. And so oftentimes there was much more of a willingness to acquiesce to the throne of his son, Fernando VII. So they would contend, right? They could contend, we only acknowledge Fernando VII as our monarch that we owe our sovereignty to and our allegiance to, and we'll just wait for him to become free from Napoleon. But instead, right, when you look at places like Mexico City, Lima, and other cities throughout Latin America, is they form these cabildos abiertos, these open cabildo meetings, these city council open air meetings, and they declared popular sovereignty in some of the cities, and contended that, well, really, we are a separate kingdom from Spain. And so Fernando VII technically has a dual kingdom. He's king of Spain, of España back in England. And of course, it got more complicated than that. Like when you look at the person of Charles V, who also was the Holy Roman Emperor, as well as being Carlos I of Spain. They had other European realms as well. But then secondly, they have the Americas, the American realm of Central and South America and the Caribbean, et cetera, right? In the Spanish Caribbean. And so they, they contended that Fernando VII owes, we willingly give our allegiance to Fernando VII, being a sovereign people who have the right to give that authority over to him in a popular, enlightened manner. And so, there were steps of idealism that were taken. And then I mentioned a couple other people here, right? In Mexico, right? Miguel Hidalgo, right? Y Costilla. Miguel Hidalgo, he advocated at a given city during his rebellion. He advocated, let's see here, where do I have it? Let's see. He declared a national end to slavery. He eventually espoused a democratic republic of men of all colors. All right. Let's see here. I shouldn't shake things up. But there was also, I mentioned Francisco Miranda and the rights of man from the French Revolution. And so they took on universal male citizenship for all criollos, peninsulares, mestizos, indígenas, esclavos, right? Negros, pardos, the whole gambit on the pigmentocracy chart. And that was revolutionary. An end to slavery. That was revolutionary. The full acceptance and integration of Native Americans, very revolutionary. And so notice the North Americans, right? The Norte Americanos, they did not have the boldness. They had a conservative consensus to not tackle any meaningful radical changes. Nothing for women, nothing for slaves, nothing for Native Americans, not even universal male white citizenship, but they still had property requirements for citizenship. And so there was a very narrow strip of issues that the Americans agreed upon to change fundamentally. Not a lot fundamentally changed. But for Latin Americans, right, they took these issues on. They took the issues on, like I said, mainly universal male citizenship and the integration of people of color. What a step. And of course, they didn't succeed, unfortunately. Miguel Hidalgo, right, met his match on the battlefield and was eventually tried and executed. Father Morelos after him, same thing, was successful for a while with an army of mainly indigenous, of indigenous Native Americans, and declaring a democratic republic. They dabbled with Fourier, Charles Fourier's writings and experiments as far as like a kind of Marxism of
someone is at the front door.
A pre-Marxism of people sharing and collaboratively producing products. And so you don't see that type of dabbling in Enlightenment endeavors, Enlightenment ideas, and actually putting them into practice as you do down in Latin America. But they didn't succeed on the battlefield. And so in Mexico, right, the Plan de Iguala, they decided no. Vicente Guerrero and who else? The Guadalupe gentleman, the Guadalupe Victoria, and the other liberals, they made a deal with Agustin de Iturbide and decided, you know what, we're gonna throw aside for the sake of a common Mexico and to break free from Spain. We're going to just make kind of a conservative conclusion of equality between peninsulares and criollos, a constitutional monarchy, and a state-run Catholic Church with the three guarantees. And so it ended up being conservative, this war for independence in Mexico, but at least they tried with Father Hidalgo and others. They tried much more radical deviations from tradition. They just didn't succeed. All right. Any questions or comments? So yeah, if you wanted to look up the Constitution of Chilpancingo, some very enlightened ideas at that Congress. And the primary source I'm using besides Michael Myers' book on Mexico is Americanos by John Charles Chasteen. I highly recommend this book on the Latin American Wars for Independence. South America didn't go in the direction of enlightenment as they thought. Simón Bolivar at certain given times went in like a couple other figures, joined the French Revolution, met Napoleon, had an enlightened code that he wanted to implement, and he ended up kind of changing his view as seen in his famous Jamaican letters, where he decided when he was after he had failed his second time in winning independence for South America, he contended that the South American people are not ready for enlightened government and for democracy. So kind of a conservative ending, but boy, some really bold, innovative shots at enlightened change in Latin America, including Mexico. And when you make those types of bold, endeavors, you're likely going to elicit an equal and opposite conservative reaction, which of course they did. All right, so I'm going to put down for both of you, instead of regularly 5 points, I'm going to give you 10 points for today. I'm greatly appreciative of you being here and sticking through this with me. But can I, if not I would love to have one or both of you unmute yourselves and share anything you like with me. But if not, can I at least get a thumbs up or some type of signal that you've been able to hear everything I've had to say and have been able to follow? Thank you, Efrain. I appreciate that. All right. All right. So gracias por todo. And yeah, estoy muy agradecido that you guys have been able to come and stick with me through the lecture. And we're good for this assignment. Okay, we're good for this week. I hope to see you next Tuesday at 4. Please, if you can, continue to come. And I'll go ahead and call it a day, okay? So thank you.